It is the summer of 1944. Somewhere in the bocage country of Normandy, a British infantry section presses itself into a ditch beside a sunken lane. The hedgerows are thick enough to hide a house. The air smells of cordite and churned earth. Then comes the sound every infantryman in the European theater has learnt to dread: the groan of steel tracks, the guttural idle of a Maybach engine, and the slow, mechanical certainty of a German tank moving through the lanes toward them. The section commander, a corporal from Lancashire who has been fighting since Sicily, does not reach for an anti-tank rifle. That weapon is already obsolete, its solid steel bullets deflecting off the sloped armor of a Panzer IV like stones off a monastery wall. He does not call for an artillery strike. There is no artillery within range. He does not order his men to retreat. Instead, he reaches for a squat, ungainly-looking device that resembles nothing so much as a drainpipe bolted to a bent metal tray. He loads a finned projectile into the front end, braces the contraption against his shoulder, and waits. When the tank appears around the bend in the lane, no more than 30 meters away, he pulls the trigger. There is a thump, not the crack of a rifle or the boom of a field gun, but something duller, more industrial. The finned bomb arcs through the air in a shallow curve and strikes the tank's side armor just below the turret ring. What happens next has nothing to do with impact or penetration in any conventional sense. There is no armor-piercing shot tunneling through steel. There is no kinetic energy, no hardened tip grinding through plate. Instead, something far stranger occurs. The tank's armor does not crack or shatter. In the most literal sense imaginable, it melts. A jet of superheated copper plasma, traveling at more than 8 kilometers per second, burns a tunnel through 60 millimeters of Krupp steel in the time it takes to blink. The tank stops. The crew does not get out. This is the story of the projector infantry, anti-tank, the PIAT, and of the extraordinary scientific principle that made it possible. It is the story of how British engineers, working under conditions of extreme wartime pressure with limited resources and even more limited time, discovered a way to turn the laws of physics against the most feared weapon of the Second World War. It is a story of brilliant improvisation, industrial ingenuity, and a discovery so counterintuitive that it took years for military planners to fully believe what their own weapons were doing. To understand why the PIAT existed at all, it is necessary to understand the crisis that produced it. In the summer of 1940, the British Army returned from Dunkirk with its tail between its legs and precious little else. Equipment had been abandoned on French beaches in such quantities that the Army was, for a time, genuinely unable to equip the divisions it was trying to reform. Anti-tank capability was among the most pressing deficiencies. The standard British anti-tank rifle of the period, the Boys anti-tank rifle, had been designed to counter the thin-skinned tanks of the mid-1930s. It fired a .55-inch solid steel bullet at high velocity and could penetrate armor up to about 21 millimeters thick at 100 meters. When it was designed, that was more than sufficient. Most contemporary tanks had armor no thicker than 14 millimeters. But German tank design had not stood still. By 1940, the Panzer III was appearing with 30 millimeters of frontal armor, and the Panzer IV could be up-armored to similar standards. Against anything heavier than a light reconnaissance vehicle, the Boys rifle was close to useless. The British Army desperately needed something a single infantryman could carry and use at close range against medium armor. The options available were depressingly limited. A rocket launcher on the American model, what would later become the famous bazooka, required propellant and a launch tube of considerable length. Recoilless rifles were theoretically possible but demanded engineering refinements that would take time Britain could not spare. Anti-tank grenades had existed since the First World War, but they required the thrower to get close enough to a tank to be killed several times over before reaching throwing distance. What the Army needed was a weapon that was cheap to manufacture, simple enough for a conscripted soldier to use after minimal training, light enough to be carried over any terrain, and powerful enough to defeat armor that no portable kinetic weapon could penetrate. Every one of those requirements was individually achievable. Meeting all of them simultaneously was something else entirely. The engineers at the projectile development establishment at Welwyn Garden City, working under a designer named Stuart McCrae and the eccentric genius of Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, believed they had found a way. Blacker was not a conventional military engineer. He was the kind of officer the British Army occasionally produced and never quite knew what to do with. Intellectually restless, contemptuous of institutional inertia, and possessed of an almost childlike enthusiasm for mechanical novelty. He had already devised the Blacker Bombard, a spigot mortar of eccentric design that had been adopted, somewhat reluctantly, as a home defense weapon. The spigot principle, in which a projectile is launched not from a tube but from a central spike that enters a hollow tail, was his particular obsession. It dispensed with the need for a conventional propellant cartridge and barrel, allowing the weapon to be both lighter and simpler than a conventional mortar. The PIAT emerged from this work. Its operation was, to put it charitably, unusual. A powerful spring inside the body of the weapon, compressed by the user before firing, drove a steel spigot forward when the trigger was pulled. This spigot struck a propellant charge in the tail of the bomb, which fired the bomb forward and, simultaneously, recompressed the spring for the next shot, at least in theory. The weapon weighed approximately 14.5 kilograms, 32 pounds, loaded. Cocking the spring for the first shot required the user to lie on their back, brace the weapon against their feet, and heave with both arms until the mechanism locked, an effort requiring something in the region of 90 kilograms of force. In cold weather, or after a day's march, this was an enterprise that frequently defeated soldiers of average strength. On subsequent shots, if the mechanism cycled correctly and the operator had maintained their grip through the recoil, the spring recocked itself. If they had not, they were back on the ground again. None of this mattered, because the thing the PIAT fired was extraordinary. The bomb was a shaped charge round, and the principle by which it worked had been understood, in theory, since an American engineer named Charles Monroe first described it in 1888. Monroe noticed that when an explosive charge with a hollow cavity in it was detonated against a metal plate, the cavity focused the energy of the explosion inward and then outward in a concentrated jet, penetrating far deeper than a solid charge of the same weight. For 50 years, this observation sat in scientific journals, curious and apparently impractical. It was not until the late 1930s that researchers in Germany, America, Switzerland, and Britain began independently to understand the mechanism well enough to exploit it militarily. The key was not the cavity alone. When the hollow in the explosive was lined with a thin layer of metal, typically copper and typically formed into a cone or hemisphere approximately 2 millimeters thick, the detonation wave collapsed the liner at extraordinary speed. The copper did not simply fragment. It was transformed into a hydrodynamic jet, a continuous stream of metal moving at velocities between 6 and 8 kilometers per second at the tip, tapering to perhaps 2 kilometers per second at the rear. At these speeds, both the jet and the target armor behave not as solids but as fluids. The copper flows into the steel, and the steel flows out of the way. The word penetration is technically accurate but slightly misleading. Displacement is closer. The armor is not drilled, it is pushed aside. The PIAT's shaped charge warhead contained approximately 280 grams of RDX/TNT explosive filling and a copper liner formed into a hemisphere roughly 89 millimeters in diameter. That is, about the same diameter as a large orange. When functioning correctly, this warhead could penetrate approximately 75 to 100 millimeters of homogeneous steel armor. This was sufficient to defeat the side and rear armor of any German tank in service in 1943 and the side armor of most tanks encountered for the remainder of the war. The warhead was manufactured at facilities across Britain, including Royal Ordnance factories at Chorley in Lancashire and Bridgend in South Wales. The projectile bodies were produced by engineering subcontractors whose peacetime work had included everything from agricultural machinery to bathroom fittings. Production figures for the complete weapon system remain partially classified, but estimates suggest that somewhere between 100,000 and 115,000 PIAT launchers were manufactured between 1942 and 1945, with warhead production running into the millions of rounds. The PIAT entered service in 1943 and was first used in action during the Allied invasion of Sicily in July of that year. Its operational record was, like the weapon itself, a study in contradictions. In the right hands and the right terrain, it was devastatingly effective. In the wrong hands or the wrong conditions, it was merely peculiar. The weapon's most celebrated use came on the night of 19th to 20th May 1944, when Company Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis single-handedly assaulted a German pillbox near Crepin in Normandy with a PIAT, an action for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the only such award made on D-Day itself. But it was in the close terrain of Italy and northwest Europe that the PIAT consistently demonstrated its value. In the rubbled streets of Ortona, where German tanks could be engaged from first-floor windows at ranges of 20 meters or less. In the flooded polder country of the Netherlands, where armor was confined to elevated roads and infantry could stalk from the water, and in the close bocage fighting of Normandy, where the hedgerows that made coordination a nightmare also made tanks vulnerable by channeling them into killing grounds. German tank crews developed a profound respect, or rather a profound anxiety, for the weapon they initially dismissed as a curiosity. Reports from panzer units in Italy in 1943 describe increasing reluctance to advance into built-up areas without infantry close support, precisely because the PIAT could be fired from buildings, from rubble, from cellars. A tank that dominated open ground became vulnerable in a village. Psychological impact is always difficult to quantify in military history, but the frequency with which PIAT attacks appear in German after-action reports suggests that its effect on enemy morale was disproportionate to its relatively modest numbers. What is documented beyond dispute is that a weapon specifically designed to address a tactical crisis had been produced, from concept to frontline use, in approximately 3 years. A genuinely remarkable achievement given the industrial and scientific constraints of wartime Britain. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is worth pausing to consider how the PIAT compared to the other shaped charge anti-tank weapons of the Second World War, because the comparison illuminates both its strengths and its very real limitations. The American M1 bazooka, which entered service in 1942 and which the British were briefly offered before developing their own solution, used an electric ignition system to fire a 60mm rocket from an open tube. It was longer than the PIAT, roughly 1.37 meters against the PIAT's 1-meter Deern, and lighter at about 5.5 kilograms against 14.5 kilograms. Its shaped charge warhead could penetrate approximately 75 millimeters of armor, roughly comparable to the PIAT. However, the bazooka produced a significant backblast that made it unsuitable for enclosed spaces, and the rocket motor left a smoke trail that immediately revealed the firer's position. The PIAT, with its spigot propellant system, produced virtually no backblast and left minimal smoke. In the confined fighting environments of Italy and northwest Europe, this was an advantage of considerable practical importance. The German Panzerfaust, which appeared in increasing numbers from 1943 onward, was in some respects a simpler and more elegant solution than either. It was a disposable, single-shot weapon that fired an oversized shaped charge warhead from a lightweight tube. Early versions could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor, and later models exceeded 200 millimeters, A figures the PIAT could not approach. However, the Panzerfaust had an effective range of only 30 meters in its original configuration, compared to the PYAT's effective range of roughly 90 to 100 meters in direct fire. The German weapon was also a one-way transaction. Fire it, discard the tube, acquire another. The PIAT was reloadable, which mattered when resupply was uncertain. The Germans also fielded the Panzerschreck, essentially a reverse-engineered and enlarged bazooka. At 88 millimeters caliber and capable of penetrating approximately 160 millimeters of armor, it outperformed the PIAT in raw penetration, but it suffered all the disadvantages of the rocket system: backblast, smoke, length, and the requirement for the firer to wear a gas mask and cape to avoid being burned by their own weapon's exhaust. The PIAT occupied an idiosyncratic position in this landscape. It was not the most powerful of these weapons, not the lightest, and not the simplest to operate. What it offered was a specific combination of characteristics: manageable size, reusability, enclosed space capability, and reasonable effective range that made it particularly well suited to the tactical conditions British and Commonwealth infantry most frequently encountered. The historical legacy of the PIAT is more complex than its wartime reputation suggests. In the immediate post-war period, the weapon was largely regarded as an expedient, a clever solution to a specific problem, superseded almost immediately by better engineered successors. The British Army adopted the American 3.5-inch Super Bazooka in the late 1940s and subsequently moved to the 84mm Carl Gustav recoilless rifle, which remains in service to this day in upgraded form. Nobody mourned the passing of the spring-cocking exercise, but the shaped charge principle that powered the PIAT's warhead did not pass. It proliferated. Every modern anti-tank missile, every rocket-propelled grenade, every LAW rocket carries at its core the same physics that Charles Monroe described in 1888 and that British, German, and American engineers simultaneously realized in the late 1930s. The RPG-7, perhaps the most produced anti-armor weapon in human history, fires a shaped charge that works on precisely the same principles as the PIAT's warhead. The Milan, the Javelin, the Cornet, all of them achieve armor penetration through variants of the same Monroe effect, the same collapsing copper liner, the same hydrodynamic jet. The material legacy of the PIAT itself is modest. Examples survive in museum collections across Britain and the Commonwealth, including at the Imperial War Museum in London, the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset, and the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. Some retain their original finish and markings. Others show the wear of active service. They are ungainly objects, and deliberately handling one, which curators occasionally permit, is an instructive experience. The spring tension, even unloaded, communicates something essential about the wartime experience. This was not a weapon of elegance or comfort, it was a weapon of necessity. Return for a moment to that sunken lane in Normandy. The tank has stopped. The corporal from Lancashire is already moving, pulling his section back along the ditch before the infantry accompanying the tank can react. He does not fully understand what has just happened to the vehicle he has destroyed. He knows the weapon works. He does not know about copper liners, hydrodynamic jets, or the Monroe effect. He knows that a shaped charge warhead, fired from a device that looks like a plumber's accident, has defeated something that 60mm solid shot could not scratch. He knows that works. What the engineers at Welwyn Garden City had given him was, in the most precise scientific language available, a controlled paradox. They had created a weapon that defeated armor not by being harder than it, not by being faster than it, but by temporarily making both the projectile and the armor behave as though they were not solid at all. In the microseconds of detonation, the boundary between matter and energy became briefly negotiable. The copper liner ceased to be a metal object and became a directed force. The armor ceased to be a barrier and became a medium. This was, and remains, genuinely extraordinary. The Industrial Revolution had produced a century of military logic that ran in one direction. To defeat armor, you needed something harder, faster, or heavier than the armor itself. The shaped charge overturned that logic entirely. You did not need to beat armor at its own game. You needed to change the game. Britain produced this technology under conditions of genuine national emergency, with supply chains disrupted, with engineering talent diverted to a dozen competing priorities, with a war being fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. The PIAT was never perfect. It was difficult to cock, uncomfortable to fire, limited in range, and temperamental in cold weather. It bruised shoulders and strained backs and occasionally failed to arm at the moment it was most needed. Veterans speak of it with the particular affection reserved for tools that were difficult but indispensable. In the Italian campaign alone, PIAT teams destroyed hundreds of armored vehicles. In Normandy, at Arnhem, across the Rhine, and into Germany itself, the same scene played out repeatedly. Infantry, with inadequate resources, facing armor they had no right to defeat, reaching for the squat, ungainly device and pulling a trigger. The Germans called it a mystery weapon. The British called it the PYAT. It was neither elegant nor comfortable nor entirely reliable. But in the lanes of Normandy and the ruins of Ortona and the frozen fields of the Rhineland, it did what nothing else could do. It reached out across 30, 50, 70 meters of contested ground and made armored steel flow like water. That is perhaps the most British of all military achievements. Not the cleanest solution, not the most sophisticated, not the one that engineers would have chosen if they had been given unlimited time and unlimited resources. But the one that worked, built from what was available by men who understood that imperfect and ready was worth 10, perfect and too late. The tank in that Normandy lane weighed 22 tons. The warhead that stopped it weighed less than 1.5 kilograms. Physics, it turns out, does not care about the disparity.